You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. It is my distinct pleasure to have with us today Mark Granza. Welcome, Mark.
Cheers, man. Good to be here.
Yeah, and for those of you that may not know who Mark is the publisher of the online right-wing magazine, I Am 1776. And really, I think Mark sort of set the standard for diverse, engaging right-wing thought that made publishing serious articles as an anonymous writer a real thing, which I think for most people in our sphere are very, very grateful for just taking anonymous thinkers and writers seriously as thinkers and publishing them as if they were like normal people. And I think it has done our discourse and just the political sphere as a real favor. So thank you for doing that, Mark, and taking the effort to start this whole project.
Cheers, appreciate it. We've got as far as actually, I think Braddock, when we landed the RFK interview, that was the week after Bobby Kennedy announced his candidacy. I think that might be the first case ever of a so-called anonymous poster interviewing a presidential candidate. So that was pretty cool if you think of it that way.
It is pretty crazy though, how far we've come. And like recently, just the other day, I mean, in the canceling of Jimmy Kimmel's show, the New York Times published Orrin McIntyre's tweet that in many ways got the whole ball rolling. And I think people have to come to recognize that we're not just somewhere on the fringe, but that the whole online anonymous sphere of posters represent now a political bloc that has to be taken seriously.
I think that happened, yes. I think it's a sign in many ways of, it's a sign of many things. Obviously, like the collapse of credibility in the media. It's also like, I think, a recognition that people are starting to realize that despite a lot of these anon accounts perhaps not being anonymous for the right reasons, like we won't come across the troll, the immature kind of poster, that sort of like figure, but there's also a recognition that the cancel culture and the pressure and the fear that the establishment was putting on a lot of people for simply expressing their opinion was real, And so yes. I started to see, even that Elon Musk, if you remember back in the day, was quite hostile to the whole idea of anonymity. He was retweeting Jordan Peterson and agreed with him. And then, it's just started changing. I've always saw in the anon right, I always saw a kind of energy that was lacking anywhere else. So when I launched the magazine in 2020, and this dovetails a little bit, I think maybe we should start discussing about this idea of energies, because it's really what I saw. I don't tend to think too much in terms of like arguments and rationality and words. Obviously, this was like 2020, the summer 2020, after the summer of BLM, George Floyd, and then I was stuck in Italy and all the COVID. I've told this story before, but so there was a lot of like arguments missing from the mainstream, the kind of angle of attack that really captured the extent of corruption and I suppose you could say like evil in these networks of institutions. So there was also like arguments, but really like the anon right in general had more like an energetic thing about it that was lacking and continues to lack into the conservative establishment. And that's really what I so to speak, capitalized on, and I tried to grow it, and I tried to take those arguments and making them. I've used aesthetics. I've used the style of the publication, the style of the editorial a lot to make those arguments more not seemingly, but actually more professional, laid out. That's a good team on board helping me with that. And that's really how a lot of these ideas, have managed to also like infiltrate into the mainstream. Now we've got 2024, which was like a pivotal moment for me editorially, because it made me realize that like a big phase of the project was over. And that was when grandmas were holding mass deportation now signs at Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden, And it was like, okay, well, 5 years ago when I launched the project, this idea were like, and even probably like until like a year prior to that, they were unthinkable to talk about them so openly. And now they've managed to make it into the mainstream. And I think, I'm not taking full credit for it. There's a lot of people that worked towards accomplishing this sort of thing, but that was kind of like the goal of the publication from the beginning. And now we can get into that, but now I'm taking a new editorial direction, and because I think someone has to do it. There has to be someone thinking ahead of the curve again, like 5 years ahead. And this is what I really think it's lacking right now. So I don't know where you want to start, but I've got to say.
Well, I would tend to agree with you, and I think you're sensing some of the same things that I have been sensing. That I'm not sure whether it is the online right sort of emerging into an era of credibility, or whether it was Trump's reascension into the presidency. But there has been a change in many ways in the online sphere. It used to be that the online right was a very discordant, like multiple voices, like nobody, like, what is this whole thing called? I mean, people sort of said it was the online right, but nobody knew what it was, because you had guys doing everything from like, ancient archaeology to reading old German political theorists to people doing, I mean, just about anything and everything that they were talking about, and they were challenging old assumptions. They were going back to look at, especially authors who, and now I find there is a real mimetic imitation, where suddenly a single way of thinking almost has emerged, and it is threatening in many ways, I think, to constrict the whole, the right is becoming the left. The very thing like you're talking about, where the left is dead and there's no conversation and there's nothing new. In many ways, the right, as it has ascended to political importance and established some modicum of orthodoxies, especially sort of maybe around Trump and, helping him succeed and some of these things, that the amount of discordant voices who challenge the, power, so to speak, and prevailing power has diminished greatly. And I think you rightly have identified that, it's the very nature of social media sort of makes this kind of happen over time, that this is kind of where you're going to end up with social media, I think. And I think that's one of the big arguments, that this moment was almost inevitable, but here we are. And now where do we go from here?
Yeah, I've taken that angle quite visibly ever since this summer, ever since the spring, actually. It all started with a lot of these things I've been giving a lot of thought, not necessarily just because of it's my job, but it also ties a lot into like my personal experiences and some of what I was going through, have been going through for years, something which I wrote in the I Am 7, the Culture Store in the book. And so like I see basically my profession, my job as being so like an outgrow of this personal growth, spiritual growth, character growth that I've been forced to undergo, really. And forced is the right word, the right way of putting it, because as you've read, I was, I don't know how much we can mention, because the book hasn't technically come out, hasn't been delivered yet, so people might not be fully aware. But I reached a point in my life where a kind of like self-destructive path led me into a major accident in my life that happened all of a sudden and sent me to a place where I describe as hell. And then I made a good argument for it. There's a whole article in the book that makes this argument and what does hell means metaphorically in this sense. But when you end up in a place like that, you really have no choice but to reinvent yourself. Like, it's either that or death. And then ever since then, I has been in a way the vehicle that I use to grow on a personal level as well. It was never just. It was also about like fighting something outside of myself, fighting what I was seeing, like the corruption that I was seeing, arguing for like policy proposals, arguing for a cultural renewal. All of that has always been part of the magazine. But on a personal level, although that it didn't really reflect too much in the editorial, has always been this journey. It was part of the journey itself, to the point that now I've reached the point where I do not see the difference between my personal and professional life anymore. So anyway, to go back to what I think it's lacking, what I think, I guess you can say, went wrong on the right. I think that people have forgotten how to really be human online. And I have a lot to say about that. I've written a lot already about it. There's an article coming out literally today that you've overread that expands on some of these ideas. It's my attempt to articulate what a healthy masculinity looks like. But I think I've identified many of the many ways that the online, the digital realm, the social media operates in a way that prevents everything that we want, from the kind of like spiritual growth and that a lot of people are craving for, the cultural renewal, artistic renewal that people have been talking about for years, that we also really injected into the conversation back in 2022 when we launched our first issue. And generally, I think it's making people incapable of being ambitious. And this is something that I've been reflecting on a lot lately. And I tied a lot to how I see the story of Christ, how I see why I'm a Christian, this idea of really aiming high. And one of the reasons for that is that, you see this happening all the time. What social media does, it incentivizes constantly to look for people to disagree with, right? And it's like it runs completely contrary to in real life situation, right? I talk about it in this piece called No Honor Among Mutuals. I've expanded a little bit now in this piece that I'm about to publish. I fear in real life, the incentive is always to find some kind of common ground, but because of the obvious threat of physical violence, I'm speaking specifically with men, but it's also true between men and women in general.
Yeah.
But online, everything is, a lot of things are really like reverse engineer, like it's complete reverse. And we don't really we're not giving enough serious thought to this. Social media just happened overnight. Basically, I remember when it happened, like there used to be like videos of going viral on social media, the usual sort of video where they show people so looking down as if like they're zombies, and then all of a sudden just everyone got used to it. Everyone on the train is just looking down on their phone. And this happens so fast that people have forgotten like very basic things. So one of these things is that there are many that we can touch on, but if we to go back to the idea of ambition, you're constantly forced to compare yourself with people that really you think is below you, that are so easy to pick on. That's meme culture in a nutshell. So like, is there a necessity to fight these things? Yes, but the way that we're supposed to do that is to always like learning to have like self-respect and learning to have to aim higher at the same time. So one of this way would be to just act like you're a winner. Like Trump won the election, but the entire conservative right-wing establishment chose predictably not to act like as if they won. And the reason for that is because we've built an entire infrastructure on top of this cultural war mindset, this anti-woke, anti-DI, anti-critical race theory, all of that. And now what happened is that all this free speech advocacy, all this institution, all this individual making a living with that, they've been doing it for years, and now they don't know what to do. They're without the culture war itself, right? They become so like in the military industrial complex where they need to keep, the war going in a way. And I think the way that this Trump's ambition, at the same time, the kind of ambition that can bring back really the kind of golden age of culture that people talk about, is that you ought to be able to have like a genuine North Star and compare yourself using the people you respect as a reminder of how small you are, right? This will be like, this has to be the foundation of any ambition. There's people think that humility and ambition are sort of like opposite, when really actually they need each other, right? You need to be humble in order to be ambitious, and the other way around. So you need to aim to be 100, but knowing that you're 20 or like 30, 10, constantly pushing yourself. And really what the social media meme culture incentivizes is people like flattering each other and patting each other on the back for like ratioing Washington Post journalists and gender study professors, which is like, cool, I'm not arguing that people shouldn't do that. There are people like, I know Chris Rufo very well, for instance, someone I've been even working on in the past. And to this day, like we talk a lot about a lot of things. But it's in a way is actually the exception to the rule, because being useful online is a spectrum, right? The usefulness to uselessness idea, it's a spectrum, right? So it can't really be universalized in a way, because it's dependent on what are your skills, what's your knowledge, what are you knowledgeable on, even like your financial resources, your expertise, and all that stuff. So for instance, like Chris Rufo has figured out a way to be useful by hammering on this and getting stuff done with this DI, anti-critical race theory stuff. And if you go back on his timeline, back like 5 years ago, you're not going to find anything but that. He's been focusing on that. Whenever the discussion shifts, whenever people just get carried away by the algorithm, whatever the topic, the trendy topic of the day is always focused on that. So in a way, it's being useful. He's taking what he knows how to do and just focusing on being productive and achieving one goal, 1 or 2, 3 goals, And a lot of people, instead, they think being useful online is just contributing to the cause, which is like, yes, cool. Yeah, you amplify someone else's voices. You contribute to make a certain talking point more mainstream and all of that, right? We all know what people do online, the thing that makes them contributing. And that's true. But in the large picture, you are contributing, but it does not mean necessarily that you've been useful, because useful means figuring out what you know. And that's not going to be every single issue ever. You're not going to be an expert on philosophy, geopolitics, foreign policy, literature, art, technology, psychology, and all of that, right? You just figured out the 1 to few topics that you know of, and then just maybe trying to create a community, or maybe trying to support someone that you think is really solving that problem, or try to nail your writing and grow an audience by discussing that topic, by trying to find solutions to that topic. So that would be useful would look like. And I think like the right would be in a lot bigger position if people would return to do that, because back in the day, if you wanted to be politically useful, that was the only way. You should have joined a group on the ground, some kind of grassroots movement, and you would have been forced to be useful like that. And I think that's something I could keep going, but that's a couple of the problems that I see with the current state of the online right, and how social media basically engineered this crisis in a way.
Well, the 2 thoughts. The first is, I used to argue that the online right space was a really male space because of it did what you said it does. It introduces constant conflict, right? And so the idea is that it's like a fight club, and the most robust fighter would emerge from the top. But I've begun to change my mind, and I think in many ways it was reading your piece that is now in the IM7, the Culture Stone, that this is, while it appears on the surface to be a masculine behavior, is actually more feminine, because you're engaging in kind of snippy cat-like behavior. You're not really actually building anything. You're basically just keeping people who step out of line in line. And so on the one hand, you're building a kind of mimetic consensus, and then you're around, several pockets. You're a groiper, you're a MAGA, or you're whatever, but you have these various different groupings, and then the idea is that you snip at each other, keep each other in line, but it's all basically like slap fights. Nobody's actually, and it ends up being very, very almost like you're longhousing each other and just sort of keeping everybody in line. And the other thing is this, like you mentioned, building something. And I think that the social media locks you into kind of both, on the one hand, mimetic consensus, but also at the other hand on being anti-regime, anti-left. And so you don't ever develop a sense of like, what are we trying to build? What are we trying to manufacture? And this was, I've been reminded a lot recently about the Václav Havel quote or comment. If you spend all of your time being an anti-communist, you are basically defined by communism.
Yeah.
He says you're much better off to do the right thing. Now, if by doing the right thing you defeat communism, great. But if you don't defeat communism, you still can content yourself in the fact that you've lived a good life and done the right thing, because you may or may not defeat communism. And I think we're seeing some of this now, especially like you can see it in the response to the Charlie Kirk assassination, that very much now the left, the tenor and tone of how people talk about the left has really amplified. They're evil, they're monsters, they're subhuman, they're animals.
Yeah, it's very naive thing to say that. I touch on it a lot in the book.
Yeah,
the book in a way.
Well, I was just going to say, but and I think the thing that people don't stop to look at, and this I think is one of the things that you talk about in your upcoming article is, find your own evil. And I got to the point of saying, like, I think people have lost the thread and don't realize in many ways how much the things that they want to hold on to, the very things that they want to keep and save, helped contribute to getting us to where we are today. And so they don't want to look at their own evil. They just look at the enemy and they want to scapegoat him. And the idea is, if we could just kill everyone who's a lefty, just banish them, defeat them, make them beg for forgiveness and convert to being right-wing people. If we just got rid of the left, the world will just magically emerge into some sort of idyllic, utopian state.
Yeah, when you're really like preserving the same psychological structure.
Exactly. And so you, in some sense, you're watching the right now, and you're realizing that the right is becoming the left in terms of what its character, and it's like, not the sense that the ideas are the same, but essentially it's taking on the same aspect and mode and behaviors that we've begun to mirror the enemy in the dialect. And I think part of it is the online game creates this and amplifies this dialectic and doesn't allow you to sort of do the right thing.
Yeah. So a little bit to unpack here. I mean, first thing I would say is that we should be careful to say, I'm not saying as a critique of you, I'm just thinking a lot, but to really conflate what we mean by the right is becoming the left, in the sense that it is true that it's coming to resemble a lot of the psychological structure, like this.
That's it. Yes.
Why Nietzsche called resentment, right? And at the same time, there is. I'm not really not even that too interested to talk about on a policy proposal level, because precisely I've been trying to convince people that while the administration itself is fully justified, and to be honest, should have done a long time ago. I'm not saying like this administration, but in general, this idea of like purging and destroying these left-wing networks, this criminal networks.
I agree, Mark. I do think the world would be better off without leftism.
And after the on the aftermath of the Kirk's assassination, it was like it was depressing in a way. I mean, obviously for the the evil itself and the tragic aspect of like 31-year-old father dying in front of his kids. But aside from that, the obvious, it was also like a big blow for the culture, because it forced really the entire scene and political movement and the entire country, the entire conservative, populist, right-wing movement, anti-woke, anti-left, whatever you want to call it, just forced them back into the exact same mindset and the exact same war mindset, cultural war mindset, that it seemed like for the first time we could have not really get past it in the sense of forgetting about it, but really like taking it to the next level, which is what I meant by, okay, now we won, gonna act like we're the winners. We're even gonna extend a hand, and extending a hand to your enemy is actually a pretty defined act. It's like saying you're not powerful enough to be a trouble to me. So yeah, come to our dinner parties, we'll send us our CV, we'll consider it. Like this idea of like really taking it to the next level and focusing on cultural production. So cultural production doesn't even have to be necessarily be about writing and painting and producing content online, writing books. Any of that stuff is obviously culture, making movies and all of that. It also means like the definition of culture, it's actually how you live, right? So, I wrote a thread about this, like coincidentally, like the week before, a few days before the assassination. And then after the assassination was like, all right, so this is not going to happen now. But the thread was essentially about making the argument that the best way to actually show defiance, and to actually best way to, even if you're just interested in like ratioing and owning the libs, there's nothing an Antifa activist hates more than seeing his opponent happy, living their life and posting about it and just smiling in life and getting married and having kids and all of that. And the best way to actually win from a cultural perspective, like literally from a culture by definition, is to have that return to that kind of culture where everyone is just offline. Obviously, like completely offline is never going to happen. I'm not delusional about that.
No.
Things are part of life now. But I mean, you can still use social media as a way to fight the war without fighting the war, and actually that's the best way of winning it. And what I was essentially arguing is essentially that in order to win a cultural war, you need culture, not war. If you just do war, you're always going to end this cultural war. So this is a complex argument to make in relationship to current events, right? Because like this introduces this idea of like, how should the admin behave? And obviously like the administration it should just like really once and for all go after these organizations and just cut the money, cut the funding, get to the heart of it, and do what it should have been done years ago. What we've been arguing, by the way, for 5 years with the magazine as well. But in terms of like where the culture should go next, this is what I'm trying to do now with the publication. Like we're taking this transitional period, which is a very risky one, but I don't care. Like I want to be 5 years ahead of the curve as I was like 5 years ago. No, I don't really see anyone else trying to do that. People are running out of ideas. They become dependent on like squeezing this cultural war until the end. They become dependent on this owning the libs and just like anti-left thinking, anti-left everything, anti-left, farming for engagement online endlessly without going anywhere, being dragged distracted by the news cycle constantly. There's no focus. There's no more great discussions. There are no great essays. There are no more real reflections. There's no really displays of humanity, displays of greatness. There's no people really arguing for that anymore. It's just become very, very meme-like, just very, very uninspiring. And so, like, I've taken this break, which lasted longer than I thought, to get the book down this summer. And now that I'm back, it was very shocking to get back online when I generally, like, one of the craziest. I mean, that by definition, everything I went through over the summer to get the book done was not, sorry, by definition, but by modern definition, was crazy, in the sense that it was definitely not average. Everything that happened to me to get the book done, because it was a major psychological and spiritual transformation necessary, and it required like really intense experiences to get to that point. So, but when I came back, I generally felt like, for the first time, how a veteran coming back from like 5 years in the Middle East feels like, going to a festival or like watching a Netflix movie or something. It was like, or like going to the grocery store and just seeing people just going about their life as if nothing happened. It was like that. It was and on top of that, I would say, then this is something I realized actually the other day, basically yesterday, I would say, and I reflected it on this article I'm about to publish on masculinity, is that one of the things that happen when you really give genuine thought to where the culture should go, or better yet, when you give genuine thought on what you are for, and you figured out really, like, you put your anchor somewhere, right? It could be family, and then the outgrow of family, the country. It could just be something that you love. And there's a lot of things that I love in terms of, like, I'm basically addicted to it, like beauty, this idea of like beauty. I just love aesthetics. I love beauty. I love style. I love class. I love, I love great stories. I love this, great movies. And when you really figure it out and you put this whole thing into a ball, and then you try to outgrow your editorial vision out of that, and while forgetting about really what you're against and what you wish to submit, or what you wish to see kneeled in front of you, this idea of like owning the people that have maybe mistreated you, or like prevented you from achieving your full potential, because these things happen, like, you can't really blame straight wild male for being resentful even. I mean, they have a lot of reasons for being resentful. But when you really figured out what you're for, then you get back online, and it's like, it's really hard to just see this thing happening all the time, this anti-left thing, uninspiring, very weak, very naive as well. It's extremely naive to like you were touching on, and I've touched about. Essentially, the book is all about this idea that you should look for evil inside of you, because it's generally how you become what Jung calls integrating the shadow, and like how you become who you are, how you become wise even. That's what Solzhenitsyn did. That's how he essentially took down the Soviet Union. He took down an empire by looking for evil inside of himself. And he did it at its lowest point, right? That's how powerful that book was. And when people constantly look for evil outside of themselves, they makes them for like good posters, right? They get trained to do this, to engage this like very feminine way of warfare. They're forced to, there's no alternative. You can't actually be masculine online. It's basically impossible. But especially what it does to them is that it prevents them from being really equipped to fight evil in the world, because the best way to do it is leading by example, always. And I'm separating right now this idea of like fighting evil from the political, and just fighting evil as such, right? Just fighting evil. Like, let's forget about politics for a second, and just like, how do you fight evil, right, in the world? It's just like, always lead by example, always search it within you, always try to think about how, when something is going wrong, trying to think about how you could have contributed to that. It's also always about, if you really want to do a spiritual and psychological journey, if you really want to think, you have to like search for all these forms of evil within you. So when I talk about in something like the War of Angels essay, I talk about in the book, I touch on it a little bit even on this piece that I'm about to publish, I talk about this idea of like finding evil within yourself. It's not necessarily about finding the desire to do evil, right? Because like you might not have it, but you need to find within you the potential for that kind of evil, right? So, and this is not a mental exercise. It's literally trying to find it within you, like try to think, how can I be a prison concentration camp? How could I become a serial killer? How could I become, if everything goes wrong, how could I become a wife beater, or like, just even a lefty? You cannot depict, and you cannot really fight a lefty to the extent, a political opponent effectively until like you see it within yourself. I mean, you technically can from a political perspective, but it will not create the kind of growth that you want. It will not create, like you were mentioning, the kind of culture and establishment and just character of the nation that people talk about, that people want. You have to find for everything that's wrong with the world. That's ultimately what makes a masculine man, in my opinion. Like I talk about this idea of healthy masculinity. It's ultimately this, like you incorporate your shadow essentially by realizing that every form of evil ever committed in the world was committed by human beings, and you're a human being as well, and even if you're not capable of becoming a serial killer, obviously the thought never even occurred to me, but it's always useful to try to think, like what could turn me into one, trying to really think. It's going to be hard. Like the further down you go into this evil rabbit hole, the harder it's going to be. Like, can you really see the pedophile within yourself? I tried. It's just like, I can't even think about it too much, to be honest. But I can definitely find the prison concentration camp within me. Like I've experienced resentment before in my life, and I could see how I get to the point of really becoming like a communist prison guard, to the point of like genuinely enjoying doing that. And people did that. That's the lesson of the 20th century. People who thought they were good ended up becoming this kind of like force of evil. So anyway, I could expand a lot on this. I don't know what you would prefer to expand on, but I think this is a major problem, especially among young people on the right. It's a huge problem. It's basically got to the point where no one is even like considering these ideas. It's making young men very, very weak spiritually. Mm-hmm. Not talking about physically strength. There are a lot of people working out, and that's good. That's an aspect of strength as well. It's always useful to have, for women to have like someone capable of protecting you. It's always good to have like a healthy people that can fight in a war. But it's only one aspect of what makes a warrior, and so that's that kind of aspect that is missing among young people today and among the right in general, with notable exceptions, but still they right approve the rule.
Well, it is interesting, as you're talking about this, Mark, this idea, it's very easy to know what you're against, right? And I think for a long time there has been that this is what has unified all the various different factions in the online right, is that, they're against the left. And the left is, in a sense, against the right, because the right are the enemies of progress. They're holding progress back. The one thing that the left has that the right doesn't is that the left knows where it's going. It knows what it wants to do. It's seeking to engineer society to create, a utopian progressive future. And they have a series of things. We're going to end poverty. Everyone is going to be, there's going to be, general equality and equity among people. We're going to end racism. All of these things that they have a definite vision for what they're going to end. But I think if you ask people on the right, I'm not sure how many of them really know what they're for. Or if they're for something, it's kind of, the sense I always get is what they're for is the kind of propaganda images that they see on the TV.
It's very abstract. Very abstract.
They want a certain life the kind of beautiful life that they see on the television. They kind of want that for themselves, but they don't really know why. What are they for? And in this sense, there's a kind of nihilism. And so by being against the left, you then never have to face the reality that maybe the things that I want aren't really all that great, or they're very empty and hollow. Like if I really focus on the things that I most want, do they seem really, really shallow and empty? Are they vacuous? Are they, like the author of Ecclesiastes, are they empty and vain? And I think for a lot of, if people really get honest with themselves, a lot of what the right is fighting for, unfortunately, and this is kind of in my mind, is empty and vain. So what are you then trying to build? And I'm not sure, like, as you say, that social media will actually help you build anything. And another difference between the left and the right is that the left has real organizations. They have real meetings. Like they have, you go to Harvard and you get into the club in Harvard and you have real networks there. And then social media is a layer on that kind of, turbocharges the real life political connections that they have in political and business. Whereas the right is trying to reverse engineer this through social media to create real world networks. And I'm not really sure that you can. And I'm not really sure. I mean, I know the left tries to do it, that you build community around ideology. Like a good person is the person who has the right political ideas. But I'm not really sure. Like, I don't think that the right really loses if that's what they try to become, in a sense of like, if we impose the right political ideology, we can build real existent networks of communities. And I'm not really convinced that you can do that. And so, as you say, in some sense, you almost have to unplug and go back and build the communities, but then ask, like, what kind of community am I trying to build? What do I believe? What do I want to see happen in the world? What do I want to see happen in my life? And I think there's a lot of people whose lives are empty and meaningless, and the meaning in their life is found in defeating the left. Once the left is defeated, then we're just going to magically emerge into this new beatific life. Utopia will just come. And while the left does need to be defeated, I think they're an obstacle to living a good life. If you don't have any idea what that good life is going to be, what will happen when the left is defeated? And that's, I think, the question I want. And I think before you answer that question, then you have to acknowledge, what are all the ways that I have contributed to creating the left, creating all the problems that the left is then reacting against? How are my belief systems contributing to that? And that's where I came down to things. I think before you can actually even build something, you have to confront yourself, and confronting yourself. And you talked about this in confronting the shadow, but I talk about it in terms of like repentance, sort of use that maybe we were wrong.
Two things that can be tied. Yeah, I could talk about that.
Yeah.
I would say that I want to touch on this idea of how social media is making us think like a machine. And in many cases, it gets to the point where it's essentially, you'll start noticing that a lot of what you see on the timeline, so to speak, is basically the machine talking to itself in many ways.
Absolutely.
And to the point where literally that's all I see now all the time. And this idea of like that I touch on the book, I also touched on the book, but on this piece I'm about to publish today, I've been writing about the past few days, is this idea about reason. This obsession with reason is actually a lot more harmful that people think. And I'm talking about the people that actually reason. The left really doesn't. So like, there's a space for, obviously, like, we all know what the role of reason can be in society, but this is also like very limited. It's very limited, first of all, because your intellect is very limited. You can be 180 IQ person, and you can make really great critique. You can be Nietzsche. Actually, people cannot today, fortunately, but you could be Nietzsche. You could like just demolish the entire foundation of Western civilization and just leave everything hanging like that. Cool. But you're not really going to create anything new. That's why Nietzsche, by the way, didn't create never created anything new. It's just like demolish the foundation and just like, okay, now what? And because the reason that I touch on this book and relates also to this topic of healthy masculinity, it's a larger idea that touches on what do we need to find that kind of ambition, to build that kind of greatness. And I think the answer lies within going back to look at a world as our ancestors used to. It does not mean we incorporate some of the archaic beliefs, which, by the way, a lot of these beliefs were not that archaic as they look. They were not as primitive as people think of them. They were just their best attempt to look at to describe what they were saying. If anything, all the ideas, the great ideas that we have left, the same ideas that you see and you buy, and every time that you watch a movie, you think about like the Bible. The Bible was written like thousands of years ago, right? And these people were not reasoning. They were not reasoning. They were poets. Whatever the inspiration came from was not their intellect. And this mythological idea that are the bedrock of every story that we watch. This idea of the hero's journey, this idea that in suffering lies, there's a treasure buried beneath the dragon, so to speak, metaphorically, that in suffering lies the potential for transformation. You will not watch a movie without that, some kind of incorporation of that idea into the movie, right? You're not going to watch 2 hours of a guy just having a good time walking around for life as if like suffering does not exist. You always want to see someone overcoming challenges in order to even like being interested in a story. So what I talk about, I call this the re-enchantment of the word. And the best thinker that I've ever come across, because he was a thinker at the end of the day, he was also an artist in many ways, but the best thinker that I've ever come across, because I'm also like very interested in psychology, is Carl Jung. No one like Carl Jung. I can just pull any quote completely out of context. I immediately relate it to something that either happened to me or I just get it. I think it's just probably the smartest guy of the 20th century, I would say. But in a way, it's like the guy was not, most of the times, it was only trying to make, one of the reasons why people dismiss someone like Jung is because obviously gets into a lot of this mystical stuff and trying to articulate it in the best way that he understands it. And that's always like when you're venturing into the unknown, right? Into the deepest recess of your unconscious, for your dreams, for like psychological and spiritual exercises, whatever, like the kind of what you see, so to speak, what you experience, it's not something, it's not easy to articulate. And the reason for that is because I think the way that I understand and I've learned to look at the world as increasingly so, especially since the summer, is that it's not what it looks like, right? Where the idea of the re-enchantment, the word, is this idea of like stop thinking like a machine. A machine will never grasp meaning. AI will never, ever, not in a million years, not even import entire North Korea into America. It will never be conscious. It will never think like a human being. It will never look at the world as a human being. All it's going to see is objects, but it's not even going to see the object the way we look at objects. We think like we see objects, like a chair. You don't see a chair. You think you do, but a chair can easily become something that you use to change the light bulb. You can easily something that you throw. I don't know if you're British and they enjoy doing that stuff. Like throwing chairs at each other. I'm joking, obviously, but that it can be a weapon, right? It's the word is not what it looks like, and especially like the way that you should approach life. It should be like a quest for understanding meaning, right? So the way that I've done this summer intensely, like very, very intense, it got to the point where like it was mentally excruciating because I was always on the alert, always trying to interpret so-called signs. And obviously like this, you have to be careful, right? Because this sort of thing can drive you out of your mind because like you're not equipped to understand just how I think everything makes sense, just how things happen for a reason, just how complex the plan is from like, if you think of it like a Christian perspective, you're not equipped to understand it. But you either buy the idea that everything happens for a reason, or you buy the idea that nothing happens for a reason. There's no in between, right? Which means that if everything happens for a reason, then everything in life does. Why does you meet a person in your life? Everyone instinctively understands it. Like you've had intimation in your life where you meet a person and that person, you feel like it shows up for a reason, right? So that you extend that idea to everything, like why there's a book right here, right now, right? And that level of complexity at some point becomes too much for you to grasp. But it shouldn't stop you from trying to walk through life with that kind of mentality. Like There's a reason why things happen, and they're not what they look like. People are not really people the way we think of them in the sense, because they can act towards you as like a stepping stone towards your next life's journey, right? Down to the person you meet at the bar, down to the clerk, obviously your family. And a way that I've been working on this book is like, think of the world like that. And when you really do that, when you try to do that, you venture into this. It was like really like journey, the most incredible adventure of my life in the sense. It was like, it was haunting at points, like really to the point of like driving you mad, into complete madness. And I mean madness with a capital M, but you always have to resist it, because really like the closer you get to God, the bigger the devil in the sense, right? That's really why, stop me by the way if I'm ranting.
No, it's fine.
In advance, I think like, I don't think, I can go into places where I think like all these images and like always trying to paint a puzzle here, but this idea of like trying to get to find who you are, trying to grapple with the idea of destiny, grapple with the idea of like purpose and why we're here. The closer, the more you're trying to get to this truth, the more something's going to stop you. And I've had experiences. Maybe I thought about whether I should say something like this. Maybe this would be a good opportunity. I don't know if you're going to be interested in this, but I don't know if the audience, what is going to think about this. But I can tell you about the worst dream that I've ever had, which was also the best dream I've ever had at the same time. So writing like War of Angels, this chapter that's included in the book, which ties into what you and I have been discussing now, this idea of like building a culture that's built whose foundation are something positive, right? But also this idea of like finding, in order to properly produce art, finding evil, finding the enemy within you, right? This is you can make many examples. One example that I made is The Lives of Others. Great movie where the Stasi spy was like sympathized, right? It was humanized to the point of like, there's like a scene that basically just like, it's one of the best scenes I think of the 20th century, where the Stasi spy just basically becomes human right in front of you. And that's because the director saw the Stasi spy, the communist, within himself, right? So I was talking about this, and the more I started to do this, the more I started to call, so to speak, chasing the rabbit, right? Just how much evil can I really find within myself? And I got obsessed with this idea for various reasons, because like some of my life experiences like forced me to think about this question, something that I talk about also in this chapter called Out of Hell in the piece, in the book. But it got to the point where really like I've become obsessed with understanding evil as such. Like what if I had an empty canvas and I wanted to pick evil as such, what would that look like? How do you describe it from a cultural and artistic perspective? Like, how would you represent it? Evil as such. So like, this was just a part of the thoughts, part of the journey, part of the psychological journey. Like it necessitated this kind of like thoughts and this kind of like sort of meditations. And it got to the point where I returned to Budapest, from Budapest to Italy. I decided to take, I don't know how long I'm going to be here, but for now, I'm just here, sorting things out. But, I had to come home to finish this book. And then I ended up staying with Braddock for a week in Verona because he was visiting Italy. So we met here. We got an Airbnb together. And then I had this nightmare, which is a recurring nightmare that I've had throughout my 20s, where like something is sleeping next to me. And I no matter how hard I try to turn around, I just can't look at that thing in the eye. And finally that night I did. And I think what represented that was this idea that evil lives inside of me, right? It sleeps next to me, right? Don't think about the shadow if you want. You can just think of it in terms of like, this quest of understanding that, the kingdom of God and by extension, the devil inside lives inside of you, right? And when I managed to finally did, it was the craziest thing, the weirdest thing that happened is that almost like an oxymoron to think of it. My eyes like burned by what I saw, but I saw nothing but black. I saw nothing. I saw just dark. And I had to look away. I woke up with like that feeling like my eyes were burning as if I watched like the sun itself, that feeling when you watch the sun for like longer than 2 seconds. And I think that what that meant is that no matter how hard you try to understand evil as such, it's just bottomless. It's more bottomless than we think it is. But it was the worst nightmare I ever had. I wasn't scared at any point because at that point, like, it's what I wanted. I wanted to look at what would it be to look like the devil himself in the eye, you know. But so I was like, the feeling was great when I woke up, like so satisfied that I finally managed to turn around and look at this thing. Like always was something preventing me in my nightmare. I just never turn around as if like something was stopping me. But that was a like really powerful like nightmare in the sense that it's also like a very humbling one. Why is a very humbling one? Is because like I'm not Christ. You know, I am a sinner. I will never get the opportunity to meet the devil in the desert for it to come and make me a final offer, because I've not find every single form of evil within me. I have not managed to dominate every form of evil within inside of me. I'm a sinner. I made mistakes. I keep getting tricked. It's always hard to be like, you're not Christ. Like nobody walks around earth like Christ. It's just basically like almost impossible. But we can do our best, right? And with that knowledge also comes the idea that you'll never actually meet the devil himself. You'll never get to that point where you can die for humanity's sins, you know? And that's really ties into the idea of ambition, you know, like it shouldn't stop you from striving for that, right? It shouldn't stop you from striving towards greatness. So anyway, I've been ranting for a long time. I even forget why I brought this up now, but this is just to give you an idea of some of the thoughts that I think
well, I think
I remember why. This is some of the things that I think are necessary.
Sure.
Someone has to do them to like re-enchant the word, to like go back to this idea of like archetypes and finding stories. If I can just finish this whole thought, I remember now what it ties back into.
Sure.
This idea that we ought to go back to telling stories, right? Stop thinking with your mind all the time. The machine incentivizes this. It's all a mathematical equation. When you see how people interact with each other online, they're all trying to solve some kind of like equation, right? A tweet, nobody interacts with a person online. It's almost like impossible. You just see something appearing on your timeline, a tweet, and that's like there's a logical sometimes there's logic, but it's a complete absence of logic, but you still approach it as like a mathematical equation. Then you basically build your morality on top of that, and your what you think about what makes you good on top of that. Just how much I can make my own mathematics inside of me coherent, right? This idea that morality is basically like a set of opinions, right? Like a portfolio of opinions, right? And this is how we've come to think of like character and morality. And I think that's something like the death of Charlie Kirk, which I mentioned, really exposed. Like people just realized, well, actually my opinions, or maybe hopefully they realize by now, my opinions really don't say anything about me. There was this whole personality behind the opinion themselves, right? And that really I made who the man was such an inspiring figure. Not to mention the fact that Twitter never showed you all this like positive and inspiring things. It was always like something controversial, pro-Israel or whatever that made the Twitter news. But anyway, so enough with there's a place for reason, but we should not rely on it too much. We need to go back on grasping archetypes, telling stories, children enact. I talk about it in the piece, children, that's how really they learn from adults, and they learn to want to be masculine and manly by reading stories. It's not really reason. They're not, when he's playing with a sport in the backyard and is enacting the role of a knight, it cannot make an argument for honor, right? The 5-year-old kid, 7-year-old kid, it just does it because he learns about it by watching human beings. And that's not the same of like copying, because like it's not mirroring the movements. It's actually abstracting something. So anyway, I could go on and on and on. I should probably stop here.
Well, I think there's a lot there, and I think there's like another thing. One of the things is
sorry about that.
No, it's good. Like the thing is that the closer you get to God, I think, as you say, the less you're actually closer to God, but then I think there is the less that you're actually able to grasp. It's just, again, you sort of start to just begin to generate poetic imagery, the heavens declare your glory, in the sense of like, it's just like standing out there and just seeing the universe and how vast it is, and then just being overwhelmed by the whole thing. And that's the, your response. And then, like you say, what is a night like? And it's like, well, how do I put it into words? And you're like, you say, you know what, let me tell you a story.
You're not supposed to do that, to be honest.
Let me tell you a story. And then, so like, we've mentioned too, like you talk about like a character that resonates with us, a character like Aragorn, right? Let me tell you about the good king, and so you can, and this is, I think, is why Tolkien tells a story rather than try to give you a dissertation on the good king, because the story conveys it much more.
It's so powerful, it's so powerful.
That's exactly it, right? And the poem and the story are much, much more powerful that way, in a sense, because they're not rational and they don't make it nice and neat and tidy. And I think that's also one of the reasons why the scriptures generally are poems and stories and letters. They're rooted
the better
in
they
real
get,
life situations.
The better they get is better, the more actually they can actually encompass a whole rational argument, like an actual unbeatable one. Like, try to beat the Bible from a reason perspective. Like, good luck with that.
Like universalizing. Yeah. In this sense, this attempt that we have in modernity to universalize the Bible, I think, in some sense, almost destroys it, because what you tend to, you then strip it of all of its life to systematize it. And the problem is that really what you should be doing is immersing yourself in the life of the story, the letter. Like, it really matters that, even when Paul is making rational arguments, it matters that he's making them to a particular church for a particular situation, and that it connects with the real life of these people. He's just not making an argument in the abstract, even if the ideas can be abstracted from that.
You can quote with, basically,
That's right. And it's interesting too, like you talk about this whole problem of the evil that's right next to you, sort of the shadow inside of you. And I think one of the things that people wrestle with, we talk about, okay, there is a problem in the sense that God is far off. Right. And people feel that but people often want God to be far off, because if God is far off,
so is the devil.
You're not going to, there's that passage in John, everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. And so this is that sense where you talk about like the story of the Israelite people. The problem of God for the Israelites was not that God was far off, but that he wanted to make a tabernacle, a dwelling. He wanted to live right in the middle of the people. And then, so how does a holy, majestic, the creator of the universe, who by his presence defines what is goodness, how does he live in the midst of an evil people? So in a sense, that the dream that you're having every night is basically the living reality, because now all of a sudden their shadow is always being exposed because God lives right in the midst of them. Everything about, so then how do you live in a world where your shadow side is always being exposed? And this is again a sense of I think this is one of the things that social media does, is in terms of ideological battles, you no longer have to confront that in yourself, because now you can focus on a perceived enemy that's out there. And so now you don't have to confront with the reality. And so you can kind of let God slip away. You don't have to shine the light on yourself. There was two in the piece that you wrote. There was two, I think, points number 10 and 11, where you talk about, take responsibility for a friend's pain, and then putting people like, see the flaws in your parents. And I sort of see that as kind of like, don't put people up on pedestals, see them as they really are. Because the reason why we put people on pedestals is so that we can knock the pedestal out from underneath them. And then, basically justify ourselves and say, see, you can feel self-righteous in the fact that you took down the hero because now he's lesser or the same as you are. If you humanize your parents and yet you still have the command to honor them, well, how do you honor somebody who's very human? It's a very good question. And then the same thing with I think the machine way of thinking asks us, how is somebody useful to me? How does this person advance my career? How does this person make my life better? Whereas carrying somebody else's pain asks the question of, how do you make somebody else's life better? And I think the discourse never really asks that question of, how do I make my life better? Or how do I make somebody else's life better?
Yeah, good luck.
And so but the thing is, when you're in real communities where you have real people, now you're confronted with those questions. Because if you're going to live in a real community with real people, the idea that you treat them all like pawns in a game that centers around you as the main character, and either they're useful for you or they're not useful for you, that undermines a community very quickly. But if you see people as they are, and you're willing to walk beside them and share their burdens, like the guys who came and talked to Job, his friends, what did they do with him first? Well, they came and sat with him on his where he was sitting and suffering and mourning. They sat with him for 7 days before they even opened their mouths. How many of us do that with our friends, where we come and just sit with them for 7 days to kind of grasp the significance of where their pain is at before we even try to open our mouths? We just don't do that anymore.
Yeah. In a way, the right wing drive to stay online and rely on the online for political greatness and cultural greatness and achieving a great life through the digital, I think you can think of it as something similar to the left wing drive to always sympathize this marginalized community. So it's like almost looking outside of your, like hating your country, right? Because like,
that heat map that you're looking at the neighbor far away rather than the one who's right close to you.
The far away one, right? It's always like we need to do something for Africa, right? Or something for a community that's distant from mine, right? Some of the self-hatred of the left, so some of the hatred, the anti-nationalist, anti-American, wherever you live, this hatred of your own tradition and all of that comes from that. But I'm not sure I can really expand on that now because I just had that for no. So I would say, again, I have many thoughts about what somebody said. I think something worth touching on is, I can't remember if I already mentioned in that space that we did, but this quote that I've been reflecting a lot from Nietzsche is the famous one about the longer that you gaze into the abyss, the abyss gazes back into you. And I think this is very, very crucial. One of the things that people should reflect on. And I think I've figured something out that I've not seen many people talk about it or address it from this perspective, is that a lot of people think of it as like you said, as long as you don't watch, as long as you don't think about this stuff, they'll leave you alone. So they're at the bottom somewhere and you can just avoid them by not looking at them. And that's actually the opposite. I think actually what it means is that as long as you don't look at them, you don't recognize them, but they're already influencing every day of your life. You already have this greedy, vengeful thought, destructive thoughts. You already have this anger inside of you, this desire to take someone down, to be resentful, to be lustful from a Christian perspective, however you want to say, sin or evil. They're already influencing you, right? But you just shrug them off as I'm having a bad day or whatever, right? And so you do not really recognize it for a while. This idea of this is a very psychoanalytic idea, right? This idea of the subconscious, the unconscious, right? You don't actually have thoughts. You can process them, right? The thoughts emerge from somewhere. The question, what is making them emerge? What's at the bottom making them emerge? And I think that the bottom is that it is a very Christian idea, the war between good and evil, takes its place inside of you, right? Constantly on a second to second basis, right? And when I say that, I've chased the rabbit all the way down to the bottom, these exercises that I was doing, I talk about it in this article, chapter 6, called The Last Demon, for instance, is that I've started to try to pay attention to every single one of these thoughts until that point where I started to recognize some of these thoughts emerging as odd, a not me, right? So for instance, chapter 6, this chapter talks a lot about my problem with lust. That's something in my 20s, I've had, I was promiscuous and all of that. So that's kind of I call it the last demon as a reference to the 7 deadly sins that I've had to atone for and fight. And that's probably maybe the last one. And you can defeat them. You can only learn to dominate them, right? Because that's the thing. That's what the Nietzsche quote means, right? Be careful gazing long into the abyss because it gazes back into you. But what it means is really these forces start to show up as they are. So for instance, there's a nightmare in which I talk about during the making of the book, to chapter 6, is that I saw something like crawl into my bed, right? And I think that's what happens when you start to separate these things as like not me, right? If you get a self-destructive thought, let's say you're real depressed, you get a suicidal thought, that's obviously not you. If it would be you and you ever have control over it, you can just like snap your finger, stop being depressed, but you can't, right? There's something that produces the self-destructiveness. There's something that produces the negative thought, the hostile thought, the hateful thought. These things like they're produced inside of you, and the trick lies into like meditate to the point that you spot them emerging and stop them and recognize them and separate them, right? And that's why when they start to show up. So I never saw, with a couple like minor exceptions, which are like some episodes I describe as sacred, I don't want to talk about publicly, but I never saw anything. I never heard any voices once in my life. When I talk about, I hear things in me, like in my head, like your conscious talking, right? You can get to the point where it's like really clear, right? You're feeling both voices because like you shut down your mind as much as possible. It's like a meditative exercise in a way, although like I wouldn't necessarily tie to this mindfulness, new age stuff. But anyway, it's similar in that sense. But anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think these are crucial exercises to understand something like Christianity, right? So you can't, like you said, you can't really you can't really read the Bible and extract your favorite verses and apply them to your life, as if like, even the story of Christ is not a series of tweets that you can just like take out of context and so like apply them to your own life and say like, I'm a good Christian. It's better than not doing anything, not doing it at all. But it's a journey, right? It's a journey that depends on like there's a beginning and an end, right? So if Christ walks into a temple and just like gets rid of like all his praise at all, you can't really take that out of context. Like, I'm going to go into the Capitol now and drag the Democrats out of the Capitol, and there I'm a good Christian. Like, I'm like Christ. No. Christ, while he was doing that, it was still Christ. It took him a long time for him to do that, right? So that this is not a political argument, by the way. You want to go into the Capitol and drag all the Democrats out of force? Maybe I'll join you. I don't know, but the point is that it's a journey, right? And it needs to be interpreted as such, right? So, and I think that this is like what also like something like social media and this like very rationalistic, materialistic society. It's even like forcing Christians to think about this matter, this religion, and in this sense, and this very rationalistic sense, to the point that I was having a discussion recently with a couple of actually cool guys who I'm not going to say who, because I don't want to attack them at all, but they were trying to make the argument that defeating death, from a Christian perspective, the way that Christ did, can be applied to like something like Brian Johnson, what Brian Johnson is doing. This idea of like extending life to the point, this transhumanist idea of like extending your life on this planet to the point that you live forever. I think that's just dumb. You need to die. You need to die to defeat death, right? You need to. That's how Christ did it. And especially like you need to die with a great death, like a painful one, like an extreme, not just a painful one, the ultimate painful life. That's how you defeat death, right? You take the ultimate burden of humanity's sin on you. You spend every second of your life fighting this inner evil inside you, finding it within you, to the point that you find yourself in the desert 40 days, just like meditating, hoping to get the final shot with the devil. And he comes to you and he gives everything that you ever want, which you cannot universalize, by the way. Just think of like everything you ever desire in like a little, ball that right there, and just take it, right? And you will not be able to say no, forget about it. I will say yes, 100%. That's the ostentation. That's what makes it the king. Christ said no to that. No one else would do that. And that's how he defeated death. But we tend to think of it again. You think of it as like a rational perspective, because like nobody thinks in terms of like poetry and energies anymore. It's all this like freaking numbers everywhere. Just people are obsessed with numbers and logic. Like it pisses me off. Like I'm Italian futurist. I want energy. I want people walking around with baseball and beating people up on the street. I'm joking. I want stories. I want great heroes. I like football I like sport, energy back into art and culture. And it's all these freaking numbers, these nerds and word cell just all the time tweeting about stuff. There's I'm being hyperbolic, obviously, in the sense that like a lot of these guys are my friends. It's all good, but I think this is trumping a lot of this cultural renewal, this obsession with rationality and reason and numbers, and thinking of the great story is like Christ's story in this idea you can defeat death. And what does it defeat death? Well, you just take the statement, defeat death. Oh, therefore, I need to live forever. It's like, it's dumb, right? It's not what it means. It's metaphorical, right? It's not something you can take and analyze it like 2 + 2, you know? And I think like a lot of people approach the meaning of life in general now from the perspective. Everything is a number. If I see a person, it's a person in the sense like it's a class of, you know, atoms and biological stuff put together. If I see a chair, it's just a chair. If I meet, you know, you have to look at the world in a different way, in a much more poetic way. This is how all the great works of literature, all the great works of art, that's where the Bible came from. And poetry is not just, what I mean by poetry, it doesn't have to be actual poetry like Shakespeare or something. It has to be a way of thinking, you know, like Fan de Villiers. I like him as a sculptor, as a good friend. It does not think in words. He hates it. Is like a futurist sculptor, like very obsessed with vitality and all that. It does not think in words, you know, like he doesn't really like articulating what he does. He just does it, you know. So you can be a sculptor and be a poet, you know. You can be a film director, you know. It's just, you can live your life as a poet. You know, you can be a warrior and a poet, right? I talk about the Nuncio and the flight over Vienna in the book, which I have a connection to. This idea that back in the day, you can still come across it today, but you know, like people were also like approaching wars, like turning their life into a work of art at the same time. You know, it was like a way of life, like the samurai way of life. You know, at the same time, we've lost that. We've lost it. Everyone needs an argument for everything. Everyone needs to reason all the time, and there's a place for reason. I just think that we've seen actually too much of it on our own side, and it's stopping us from like really achieving greatness and bringing back beauty, all of things that really you cannot approach it with like a reason perspective. It has to come from like the heart and the soul, and the freaking machine will never help us getting there.
Well, I think that's a great note, and we probably should, because we've been going on for over an hour, and I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I think this is a great point and a great spot to kind of wind it up. And I really agree with you, Mark, in that, you know, the machine, you know, Heidegger says the machine enframes us. And I think that there's Ian McGilchrist called this emphasis on rationality a kind of, you know, mental illness that we've induced on our society. And I think, you know, you're touching on something that a lot of people are beginning to see, and that, you know, we have driven ourselves, and this, I think, is the part that people really don't want to acknowledge, that this mental illness that we've put upon ourselves to drive the rationality was instrumental in creating the world that we live in. And so, yeah, if we're going to confront the world as it is, one of these things we have to confront is the very thing that we use to create the world is actually making us mad. And this is where I talk about, in a sense of like, okay, and I think the image you used of Jesus cleansing the temple is excellent when you think about it, because it just kind of hit me. Is yes, we can go and cleanse the temple, and I think that's kind of what we want to do when we're with Charlie Kirk, is we want to go in and cleanse the temple, right?
Yeah, but don't call yourself Christian while you do that. It's just like a political solution to the problem, right? Yeah.
But the thing is, we're not Christ, so you know, Christ was perfect, and so we have to recognize that if we're going to cleanse the temple, and maybe there is a necessity for cleansing the temple, and maybe this is a thing that needs to be done, we have to remember that if we're doing it as flawed human beings with flawed motives, and
it might even be unchristian-like, to the point of being like the opposite of what Christ would suggest to do. You know,
perhaps, you know, am I opening a pathway up for the demonic to manipulate me into doing their work in the name of Christ, right? This is the kind of thing that, and because we are, you know, creatures who are we have sin within us and we have mixed motives, that it is good for us to examine ourselves.
Like it's also that thing can also not be universalized in terms of like everyone that will walk into the Capitol in that moment. Maybe there's a guy next to you who's actually in the position to do that, and you're not.
You might be right, Mark, and he's the one that needs to do it and not you, because he's already confronted himself, and maybe God has anointed and laid a hand upon him to do it. Because he can do it in a way that you can't.
Like, well, if he can do it, if I can quote tweet that argument, then we can all do it. We're all gonna storm the Capitol and do it. And it's like, I'm not making a political argument here.
No,
really. I'm not making a anti-Gen Sixers argument here at all. I'm just saying, like, this is not how you should approach being a Christian.
Yeah,
you cannot.
Just remember, you're not Jesus. And I think that's a good thing to, like. You could almost tweet that, right? But I think it's good for us to remember that when we're engaging in the political, that we're not Jesus, and there's a good chance that you're not the Lord's anointed either. You're not King David. You're not the one that God has tapped on the shoulder to do that. Now, there might be a need for King David to that's right, and to do justice, right? And justice does need to be done. But I think what happens is the whole mimetic culture is we make ourselves into kings who are then going to mete justice out on the world, and we whip ourselves into a frenzy, and we lose sight of who we are in the midst of all of this. And we're driven by the machine.
With all the talk about World War II, you think that by now we kind of like figured out what went wrong with communism and Nazism and all that, but just people don't want to accept it yet. We all went back to this like naive idea that evil is just outside of ourselves, and obviously evil monsters exist outside as well.
And I'm not manipulated by propaganda because I'm fighting. And this is the one that drives me nuts, right? Where people say I'm not manipulated by propaganda because I'm fighting against the left, and you're like, oh, really? you might want to stop and do a little bit of self-reflection.
I'm not quoting it either. It's just like it takes like more than a poster to get to that point, and we're really far off from that. We're very, very far off. Young men are very weak today.
Unfortunately, that is true.
Very weak until recently. So I'm not saying I'm neither Christ nor Solzhenitsyn, but I think that at least I'm taking the steps towards ambition, and I think that's what my argument boils down to in a nutshell. It's just a return to ambition. Energy.
Well, I think this is a good one. Like, the question of what are you building? What are you for? Yep. What are you? And I think a lot of people need to stop and think about that, Mark, is ask this question of what am I for? Yep. if and I think a lot of people can't answer that question.
This idea of like beauty also has to come back in terms of like the art and culture. It's just like find something that speaks to you. Find something that you really find beautiful. There's like, photography can help. Like I made a point in this piece I'm about to publish. Buy a camera. Like you can actually use your iPhone. iPhone just as good as cameras today. Then just take a break, leave your phone at home, or just like delete the app for like a couple of hours. Go somewhere in nature. Go to like a fancy place. I'm Italian, so I like this beautiful like coffee places and like dolce vita kind of places. But I can also take a walk in nature and just sit there and watch people. Watch around you. Like people used to live like that. Zoomers are incapable of understanding this. It's not their fault. I don't blame them. Millennials, they have a hard time. But maybe like you are Gen X or something like that. Maybe you can understand this more instinctively. I recently trained myself to do this again, but it took me some time. Like the summer was like this all summer. I was just seeing things, in terms of like not like crazy, in terms of like noticing people.
Yeah,
just like the beauty of it, and just like sitting there, and it's like there's a family, there's a dog, there are things, there are trees, there are birds, and it's like you're in the moment, with not a cell phone in sight. It's like and like culture needs to come back to the place. Like that's also like a form of like figuring out what you're for. It's sort of like figure out what you love, what you like, and what you can talk about in a poetic manner, in a way that actually inspires someone. So really,
I don't think the light.
I'm having a hard time being online on Twitter these days because I don't see any of that. It just drives me nuts. But this is I think like where I need to be. Best way to fight this mindset is on social media, and so like we'll see what where.
Well, and this is something that author Walter Ong noticed, that once the media is introduced, even Plato criticized the effects that writing was having on memory and poets, but he used the meaning of the medium of writing to criticize the effect that writing was have on it. So we're kind of trapped in a sense of the necessity. We're criticizing the effect that social media is having on us using social media, which is kind of, in this sense, not much has changed, but it is good for people to think that, if you go up to the lake and you're staring at the lake and you've brought your phone and you're snapping pictures, chances are you're not going to write a poem about the lake.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's, I think, something really, really worthwhile to think about.
The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which I really like, when Sean Penn, then Ben Stiller finally finds this famous photographer, and he's looking at this sort of like mountain tiger, leopard, and he's just like, why don't you take the pictures? And he looks, he's like, sometimes I don't. If I like a moment, I just want to be in it. It's like sometimes beauty, you ruin the moment if you're trying to, put something in between you, right? And you see that you don't have to see. You just go to any European city, Florence, Berlin, go to Paris. You'll see this. Like, nobody actually looks around. It's all filtered through this thing. Nobody notices the great buildings anymore. Really, live in them. It's all tourist, and people online. They're starting to think like tourists as well.
It was that point that you made in IM7, as what you call the book, culture, that really struck me. This point of that people, in Europe, or maybe it was in our space where you made the comment, but people in Europe don't tweet with people that they don't know. They tend to, if they use Instagram and stuff, they use it to communicate with their friends. And I really began thinking about that. And I'm thinking, like, in North, because I'm Canadian, and we have many of the same habits, but because the sort of the new world is in many ways a manufactured society, there is like real stuff there, but in many ways it's also intentionally manufactured. And because it's a manufactured thing, it doesn't have, like, when I go back to the old country, the towns that my parents and grandparents grew up in, there's buildings that go back to the 1200s, and you're thinking, like, okay, so you've got like 1,000-year-old buildings that you're surrounded by. You've lived as a people in this place for hundreds and hundreds of years. At one point, this was a manufactured community, but it's been so long surrounding us that it's just organically there. And I think there's something different in a manufactured society than, and so I, when you said that about how Europeans use, especially Europeans who live in like the old cities and the old countries and the old villages, use social media versus how we in the new world use social media, like, really struck me.
Yeah, I didn't grow up in a village or anything like that, like a small town. I mean, Verona is, speaking, a small town to London, where I lived in my 20s, for instance, but it's still a city. But it's still like, I have a hard time explaining Twitter to Italians.
Yeah, that's kind of like, and I was really thinking about that. Like, what is that? I think there's something there, Yeah.
They think, like, once you explain it, like, you look in there. If you really want to know what Twitter is, find someone smart enough that doesn't know what it is. It'll tell you. Try explaining what you do on Twitter. It'll look at you like, you're nuts. Like, why would you do that? Why would you interact with this person that you never knew as, like, standing next to you? They don't understand. It's like, Instagram is different. Facebook also, like, a lot of Italian used to be on Facebook. That's mostly Instagram. They don't really understand it. But yeah, because really, I think there's something to Europeans, to like Mediterranean, especially this idea of like poetry of life, approaching life in a more poetic manner, in this like rationalistic way, materialistic way. I think we're more, even like from I've been talking about this with Avedis a lot. We did the space together. The linguistics themselves, I think it's a so like building to the language also somehow. Like, for instance, he published a piece called "The Virtue of Cruelty" once, and I saw that piece, and I was concerned about that piece a little bit because, like, I knew how the British how the Anglo-speaking world would take that. It's like, oh, you're saying that there's virtue in being cruel, right? Right? Because that's how they take that sentence. But I just saw poetry in it, in the sense of like, it's kind of like a poetic statement, in the sense like we can all think of it in a, how a mean person can actually be mean in a good way, or, that there are, it brings up poetry in mind, like it brings up beauty and brings up life in mind. But
sometimes in order to see beauty, you've got to be shocked.
I'm not saying Anglo people are incapable of this. I'm just saying, like, I get that less. I have a hard time speaking in long metaphors. I could write a long essay which is like an entire metaphor, but it's like an Anglo-speaking country. It's not really like the audience for it. Sometimes it's like you need that kind of like structural, logical, rationalist, structured argument inside. So I think that's one of the reasons why we've lost some of that beauty, like that Italians really, it's a country in decline. It's a country in decline in many ways. There's not the same energy that there is in America, in the sense of like this revolutionary energy, this will to like the more your country gets sick, the more you want to fight it. In Italy, there's like great beauty. There's still like high culture. There's a lot of people that genuinely appreciate lifestyle, la dolce vita, people in love, looking around. It's just completely different than everywhere I've been in America. But it's kind of like without energy, in the sense, it's just like we enjoy life, we love it, but there's no real ambition in that sense either. But definitely this aspect definitely like teach to maybe like something a more Anglo-speaking country, that we have this capacity to like appreciate and look at life in a different way, and think of it, approach it in a different, with a more poetic sense. So this is why like a lot of like at the end of the day, the liberals, they're always better aesthetically speaking, not the real aesthetic itself, like what the aesthetic says, but they're better at representing, and polishing up their content online on magazines. They're better at photography. The liberal magazine always looks better than conservative ones. It's because they look up to like European countries a lot, I think.
That's an interesting thought.
And I think, so I'm a cosmopolitan in many ways, but not cosmopolitan in the lefty way. Is more in the sense of like, I just really love all aspects of life in a way. I'm just a person like who's genuinely in love with like beauty. It's my way of being like in touch with my feminine side at the same time, which is something that I mentioned in the piece, which is not the same of being feminist, just like an appreciation for like all sorts of, like, I can just look at a beautiful mother of like a classy woman with her kid and just find beauty in it. It's just something that I have a hard time sometimes making American conservatives understand. But usually they do when they see like some of the ways they use aesthetics, they get a lot of compliments for that. But then to try to explain them where that comes from, or the value of it, and why is it necessary to reintroduce this kind of or to incorporate this kind of way of looking at life for the culture at large, that I usually have a hard time doing that. With some exceptions, I've met people on the way that really understand this. But so that's something that I'm trying to do. Definitely try to do. One thing I would say, if the audience is interested in reading the book, you should approach it as like, if you've ever seen The Great Beauty from Sorrentino, you should approach it like that. It's the work. It's an attempt as a work of art in of itself. The aesthetics almost speak more. There's the symbolism behind aesthetics almost speaks more than the arguments inside the book itself. So anyway, again ranting here, so I'll stop.
Yeah. No, that's good, and maybe that's a good point to think too. It's been I've really enjoyed having you on here to talk, Mark, and do have a look at im1776.com, and also, as Mark has been talking about, the book, which is you've been moving from the digital space into hard copy books, and they really are things of beauty. And the most recent issue is IM7, the Culture Stone, and it is partly an examination of some of the issues that we've been talking about here, the right being online, but then also interwoven with this is Mark's personal journey of, self-discovery, confronting himself in the midst of all of this online, dynamics that we're going through right now, and trying to make sense of his own relationship to all of this space. So, I had a chance to read it. It was quite profound for me. I really enjoyed it. The copies, how soon till they're out in North America, in the US? Because you've had some holdups with the tariffs and so forth right now, right?
Yeah, that, and also it's significantly delayed the shipping. I mean, we shipped the first batch 3 weeks ago now, and I still haven't. I keep asking to friends, they haven't received it in the US. So hopefully any day now, really hopefully. But yeah, you're gonna have to, if you order it, probably gonna take a couple of weeks longer than it normally does.
Sure.
But it's still shipping every week. So it's already out technically. It's just because we still have distribution in Europe for logistic reasons. It's taking a bit longer now with the new tariffs and stuff.
So very good. Anyways, again, thank you, Mark. It's been a real privilege, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Cheers, man. Likewise.